late. But I've been a little late all day, so it just goes, it's par for the course. Now, I think in this second session, I'm going to bore you all with respiratory activity and a certain amount of anatomy. And believe me, it's a dreary subject. I love it, but I leave most of my audience when I go into it. It's interesting, and as I say, when you're dealing with a human being, if you had to construct a human being, it would be quite a task. You know, if you were to construct a tuba player, that's quite a thought, isn't it? You would have to make one up. You'd have to study an awful lot of physics. You'd have to study many, many things. But Boyle's law would be involved. I don't know how many are familiar with Boyle's law. That has to do with gas dynamics and what happens with air under pressure. I seem to be bending over because I like to hear myself talk. If I straighten up, I can't hear it so much. Can you? Good, it's probably even better that way. But what we're dealing with is a human being who is born to survive on this planet, and one of the things we must have is air. Now, there's a great simplicity about this subject, or we can go into great complications. Let's take it from both aspects. Could I have a young man come up, a volunteer, somebody who might be interested in making a display of himself? I might even have him stripped down to the waist, you never know. But I promise to stop at the waist. But if I can get a volunteer up here, there we are, bravo. I met this young man outside of the Academy of Music of Philadelphia. He's from the Curtis Institute of Music, right?
Yeah.
What was your name again?
Larry Tarlow.
Right. Now, Larry is going to be a very good subject when I get to him. Larry, make yourself comfortable. I don't know when you'll be in use, but hang around. What we're dealing with, of course, as I say, is a person who is born into this planet without any knowledge of tuba playing, anything about it. But he has to breathe. You know, what I'm going to deal with on this subject, I'm going to need to go to my equipment and pull out some charts, and I might have to draw a little. But I want to go in to certain aspects of respiration and how we apply it to brass instruments, and particularly to the tuba. So excuse me a moment while I fumble around through my equipment here. I had thought, if I could have had permission from the orchestra to spend the 4 days here with you, which I had originally hoped, I would have brought my respiratory equipment with me to analyze, and each day have a period where I could have some of you come in and work with you as individuals. But due to the pressure of the season, this was impossible. Maybe at some later date I could do it, but the next best thing is for me to try to indicate some of the aspects of respiration. We have what we call vital capacity. This has to do with a quantity of air each of us has as an individual that could be used in tuba playing or at anything that we want in life. And this particular phenomena, each of us is blessed by nature with a certain potential. We don't always use it, but we do have this as individuals. Now, in a young man of this type, if I had the equipment here, I would measure it, but I can just about tell by looking at him about what he would have. And we use the term liters, so I'm going to convert it to quarts instead. But in the average individual, say at about the age of 20, a young man of this type would have a lung capacity. How tall are you?
5'8.5".
5'8.5"? What do you weigh?
About 135.
And how old are you?
20.
About at the age of 20, he's 5'8". He would have a lung capacity, an expected vital capacity of about 4,800 cubic centimeters or milliliters of air. In other words, he would have just approximately 5 quarts of air that he would be able to take in if he first blew all the breath out of his lungs that he could blow out, and then after a pause, take a maximum inflation a non-musical breath, but all the air he could take in, he would have approximately, we would expect about 4,800 milliliters, 5 liters of air, somewhere in that range. It's plus or minus 20%, but we can just about predict by his body size and the somatotype of the individual. Now, what I'm indicating here is Tuba is what we call a high flow rate instrument. I did several tests at the University of Chicago Medical School where I was hooked up to spirometric equipment and analyzing equipment, and they analyzed the flow rate of air that I would use from my lungs to excite the embouchure into vibration. And my vital capacity, unfortunately, is quite small. Short, fat people rarely have very large lung capacities. And as you get older, you get smaller and smaller. Unfortunately, it's part of the aging process. And if you happen to have asthma along with it, then it still becomes even more unusable. I qualify in all the negative aspects of it. But anyway, I still function, so it's not too bad. It's a short bow, and I change it often and get by. But what I'm trying to indicate to you is that at the age of 20 or so, a person will have their maximum potential in terms of quantity of air as a potential, and it gradually reduces for the rest of his life. By the time he's in his 50s, he will have considerably less. In fact, most of the people that come to me with embouchure problems are people in their 40s and early 50s who have qualified in this respiratory reduction, and as a result, they're having reflex change on the upper end and affects the embouchure. Were you going to ask a question, young man?
I was wondering if running-type exercises would help with retaining that capacity.
Well, you can cooperate with nature to the point that you can minimize the amount of change, but you're still going to go down. But you can, by using a quantitative type of inhalation, you can ward off the undesirable effects and play till you're 100 if you want to. It's just that your bow gets shorter and shorter, and as I say, if you change it often, there's no problem. But if you try to make it do exactly what it did when it was a longer bow, you're going to be in a little problem here. Now, what I wanted to indicate is a variety of vital capacities that come with age and with size and body type of the individual. I have a few papers here of vital capacities that I've taken from individuals. Now, I don't think this is all going to be visible when I hold it up in front of an audience. I just wonder if this line coming down here, starting at the top of the page and going all the way to the bottom, is at all visible to anybody? Would that be possible to project this sort of thing? Now, let me give you a whole series of them then, and we might as well put you to work. I'll use one from Chester Schmitz from the Boston Symphony. That would be this a vital capacity test here, this line. This can be projected. How about that? There's one by Arnold Jacobs, which I'm ashamed of, but you might project that. And alongside is one by Roger Bobo. He likes it, I don't. Now, those are indicated. But now here we've got a youngster, and I want to put this on the screen also. How are we going to find out which is which? I'll be able to tell, I think. But you project these, and let me do the guessing, okay? Wait, just a minute. I've got a sick person here. I've got to put him on also. This is Arnold Jacobs with deterioration from asthma. You might take that. Let me find a real bad one. I tell you, I have to let these people in on what the real problems are, and as a result, I've got to find somebody with pulmonary emphysema and frighten everybody out of the business. You can project this. It's done through a mirror arrangement then. Would you put, if you can, this one on first? Then I want you to put on, oh, that's fine. I'll know which one I thought you had to go up in the booth. They always do that in the movies. How about that? Modern design. Now, can you project that and...
I won't be able to get the entire thing on. It's rather the top and the bottom.
I need it all. Can you reduce it? Well, see how much you can. That's terrible.
It will become better.
Yeah. Now we're getting it. Well, actually, it's not too important in this particular one, but we really need the top and bottom. I can't let this one go. But what is involved in this? Let me draw it. This young man, whose vital capacity I've tested, we have a piece of equipment where if a person, some of you have experienced this already and will know what I'm talking about, but it's a breath measuring device, barometer, spira to do with breath, and a breath meter. And when you take a huge volume of air to the lungs, you mean they can't hear that resonant voice? When you take a huge volume of air into the lungs, much as you can hold, blow up like a big frog, and you put a tube in your mouth and you go, and empty the lungs as completely and as fully as possible. This sends you do this into a piece of tubing, and a can moves up in the air. As it moves up in the air, a pen moves down on the other side. There's a revolving drum, and it writes. So we measure how much air you've moved out and how fast you moved it out. Now, the young man that I had on the first chart, if we were to make the chart, this young man, in taking a full breath and blowing it out as fast as he could, these charts that I'm using measure 7 quarts, 7 liters, and overshoots we can measure much more, of course, but we are measuring a specific quantity. Now, this young man had huge lungs. He could fill the entire chart. He's blowing his breath as rapidly as he can into the equipment to be measured. Now, in all human beings, regardless of the state of health, as you take in a huge volume of air into the lungs and you move it out as fast as you can, you're going to find the velocity of the air moving out of the lungs is under a constant change. She'll move out very, very rapidly at the start. Now, as you get in the last 20-25% of your lung volumes that are usable on a brass instrument, we'll say, there is a considerable slowing up. No matter what strength you may use to try to send it out, it will not come out faster. There are physiological phenomena involved, and actually we are running into a problem where air near the end of the breath becomes very difficult to use in a high flow rate instrument. It can be used in an oboe, which is a very low flow rate, but would not be practical on a high flow rate instrument like bass trombone or tuba. Now, I want to indicate, we'll say if this were 7 liters, which this young man had, could you put on, I see, we have that now. You can see the top of the page and the curve going down and down and down. This young man was a former first trumpet player with the Minneapolis Symphony. A man who's all chest, short legs, long torso, and enormous lung capacity. Could you put on one of the others now? I want to, let me pick one. I want to show you a sharp contrast. This is one of my favorites. The curve should be on the bottom. On the screen. Put the whole thing up. It has to be lengthwise for perspective, just like the other. This is a 12-year-old boy who is being taught by a professional trumpet teacher There we are. But really, can you reduce it so you can see the perspective of the entire sheet? There's no way? Well, then you missed the point because this, I'll have to do this myself. Thank you. Here's the 7 liters, we'll say. This would be the 12-year-old boy, or even less. In other words, The vital capacity on this youngster, while it was normal for his years, his bow was extremely small. It becomes maximal about the age of 18 to 20 on the individual. His teacher was giving him length of phrase similar to what he was doing, in other words, proper musical phrasing. The youngster had run into severe difficulties in playing because he is trying to take a small quantity of fuel and stretch it out in time to do what the large quantity of fuel that the teacher had would do. As a result, there was overactivation of inspiratory musculature, over-retention, throat reflexes coming in, severe problems developing in this young player who, if he were taught quality of tone, subphrase within phrase, so that the length of phrase was not important because his bow is very short. And at 12 years of age, it's going to be short. In the small individual, it's going to be short unless their body type is rather unusual. But as an average, you can figure a short person is going to have small lungs compared to the tall person. Now, what we're dealing with, I want to go into this subject because it's very important. Is there any way of showing the full lengths on any of these? Can this be viewed at all from the audience? Are you able to see this at all? There are two lines. One is a line of vital capacity of Arnold Jacobs. One is a line of vital capacity of Roger Bobo. The childlike one is mine. And the huge quantity is Roger's, of course, well over 6 liters. Mine at this time was 4 liters. Today it's considerably less. Overweight and too old. They both enter into it, plus pollutants and other things. But what I'm trying to indicate to you is a wide variety of fuel supplies for individuals. There's another giant. Of course, he fills the entire page. In other words, from the top to the bottom. These are people with enormous lung capacities. You turn right around, and I'll find. I always hate it when I see these big ones, you know, and it makes me very envious. Now, I want to go into some of the ramifications of this. We have problems in respiration as individuals, according to body type, according to age. We have musical requirements that we are supposed to fulfill. As in my first clinic, I stressed, and deliberately so, the importance of always keeping a perspective within your art form, regardless of how much fuel you have. We have to communicate. Now, we don't necessarily have to have the same length of phrase. There is no reason why we cannot rebreathe when we're running out of breath. So many trombone players will be using the Rochut etudes, which are simply the Bordoni vocalises. Now, the Bordoni vocalises have certain phrasing indications. The tuba uses approximately twice the volume of air in a given time factor as the trombone if he's playing 1 octave lower. And as a result, he's going to be running out of breath twice as soon. If he tries to compete with the trombonist, he's going to be stretching his air, over-activating the inspiratory muscles. He's going to be running into many problems which are really very much avoidable if he instead would work for quality of tone with shorter phrases. If he's a giant, he'll compete. But if he's one of the little fellows, you know, he can be in very serious difficulty by trying to extend the phrase equivalent to what the trombone player would do for good, tasty phrases. We can have subphrases that are just as musical and just as valid, but we must be permitted the freedom of using our breath at a manner comfortable for the individual. I want to go into this subject now, and this is going to get a little complicated, and I'll probably lose half of you, but bear with me anyway. I want to go into, first of all, we have the vital capacity. Each individual from empty lungs. In other words, residual air, sometimes used as a statement by teachers. Residual air we can forget. This is air that cannot be taken out of the lungs by any voluntary effort that we have. In the old days, the forensic test for medicine, in the sense of the legal test to see if a child was born alive or dead, was to take the lungs out of a youngster that was just born. If there was a doubt, if they removed the lungs and put it in water, if the lungs floated, that child legally had been born alive, and there might be an insurance problem. If it dropped to the bottom of the water, then it was heavier than water. He had not drawn his first breath. Residual air is involved in this. Once you take a first breath, some of the air remains in the lungs. Now, you cannot get this air out of the lungs by anything you do on a voluntary effort, and so you can forget about residual air if that subject does come up. In other words, it is not something that can be utilized in playing a wind instrument. But it will be there, and it protects you always, so there's a certain amount of diffusion of gases, even if you've blown all the air out of the lungs. It is a protection to the individual. Now, I want to get into the subject of quantity before I get into the structures involved. The average individual at the age of 20, you might say the average male, will be able to take about 5 liters, 5 quarts of air by maximum inflation. Now, less than half of this, is from the diaphragm alone. If you've ever had pleurisy and had the chest strapped by your physician to where the extreme pain of pleurisy is involved, they immobilize the region to allow healing and to remove the pain. You cannot move the ribs. If you're left with only the diaphragmatic activity alone, the diaphragm in the average individual is capable of moving about 45% of your usable vital capacity. Now, this will vary in body types according to the individual. The somatotype is very important in analyzing this, but by getting the average, we'll say 45% from empty to 45% filled can be done with immobilized ribs by diaphragmatic descent. 55% of that individual's vital capacity is there utilized by expansion in the chest due to the rib activity. Now, this will vary in certain individuals from 40% diaphragm to 60%. It can go 50-50, but it will be a variable. But what I'm trying to indicate is that the diaphragm in itself is only capable of moving half to a little less than half of your total usable lung volumes, which we will call vital capacity. The rest is due to the activity of the rib cage. Now, we don't have the skeletal charts here necessary, and I'm a rotten artist, so I won't even attempt to draw it, but I may either take my jacket off or do you have a skeletal chart? Great. That's quite a gadget. I'll have to have one for my studio also. That's good. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a posterior or rear habit. You'll see a rear approach to the skeletal structure eventually. Upper right-hand corner. You'll note, I can't go over there or I'll lose my voice. But if I were over there, I would point to the lower ribs and you will see that they are descending, that the angle of curve from the spine is somewhat down. Now, this is a rather important point. And on the left side, you'll see it even more clearly, that there is a curving downward of the rib cage. Now, in respiration, I better do this myself. I'm so fat that people will be able to see it on me a little more clearly, I think, than these skinny young guys, you know. In taking a full breath, you'll see that from a deflated position, I'll never get small. There's just too much there. But as I take a large breath, you'll see a considerable enlargement in the chest. If you were to analyze the sternal activity, you'll find that sternum has moved downward. In other words, it's hinged at the very top. And if you liken it to a pump handle, which so often in anatomy is what we use to express the sternal activity, the bottom of the sternum, in other words, the breastbone, the little bone running down here, it's complicated. It's in 3 sections, but we'll just call it sternum. This bone, when you breathe in a maximal inflation, has a pumping activity like the old farm pumps. In other words, up and down. I don't know if you can see this. I can't trust the young fellow to do it because he may not have it. I don't know. Might have to train him to do it. When we go to the lower rib cage, which is no longer present, but if it were, you would find that the lower ribs, I'm going down now to the 10th rib. If you were interested and wanted to count down, we would leave the 11th and 12th floating ribs go. They're too low for the inspiratory activity. They fix and have to do with the expiratory states, not inspiratory. But this lower 10th rib is one of our key ribs. Now, you'll find that these ribs are bound in front by cartilaginous attachments. It's bound to the breastbone. It moves up through a cartilage. They're all attached and hooks right into the sternal region through cartilaginous attachments. They are not free-floating ribs like the 11th and 12th. Now, these ribs come down from the spine in a curve. Now, when you're out of breath, the low ribs become a low inward activity. They become very short. I would love to express this with pictures, but let me see if I can get it across to you somehow. If you can just visualize my arm as one of the low ribs. If you measure the distance from front to back from here in an upward state, there's a distance between the arms in these curves that are quite large. The distance from my body forward is quite large. Now, if as I lower these arms, the curve comes in and the front goes down, you could see the distance between is getting smaller. The distance between my body and the front of the ribs is considerably smaller also. If I raise them up, they get larger. Space between increases, distance from back to front increases. If we take the pump handle on top, if it moves down, the space becomes smaller. As it moves up and out, it becomes larger. We have a motion of this type in the rib cage. Now, I will have to address myself to this quite a bit and somehow try to get a biological phenomena across to where you can understand it. In order to take maximal breaths, all parts of the respiratory system must enlarge. Most of you know about the diaphragmatic descent. I'm not so sure most of you know about the rib cage ascent, which handles the major portion of the lung volumes. There's another point that follows this. It's important. That's why we have to keep a sequence on this. But we must recognize a follow-through phenomena that exists in nature wherever muscles are concerned anyway. We have to find what are the potentials of minimum and maximum. And in breathing, we have to very clearly, to understand respiration, we have to approach it, if you want the mechanics of it, by finding maximum as well as minimum. We cannot do it for finding just enough for instrumental playing. Oh, bravo. There we come. I should have Chester Roberts up here with his big voice, and then you'll hear him all over the hall. But I hope you can hear me. This is the sternum, breastbone. These ribs are all bounded by cartilaginous attachments. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Under it, we have 2 floating ribs, which I'm canceling out temporarily because of their being too low for our activity. Now, when these raise up, you will find they will have moved laterally quite a bit as well as up. In other words, the chest is in a higher position than when we're out of breath. It's low. We have enlarged in the various planes. We've increased space in here as well as the diaphragm moving down. It is not just a diaphragmatic descent. It is a chest ascent. Now, so many people will think of it as a widening, but we must recognize for the chest to widen, it must go to a higher plane. It does not widen by just pulling the ribs backward. These are bounded. The 11th and 12th ribs can go laterally this way. They're too low to really affect inspiratory activity. In the case of these, they must go up to widen. When you hear a person who is taking a breath and the back must get wider, you should also realize that to get wider, it must also get higher. These ribs here, I don't have a proper illustration of the back, but when they move into the spinal column, if we trace a rib here, it moves way up into the back. As we trace that back, these ribs attach into the vertebral column and rotate on a specific axis. Depending on the position of your spine at any given time, they rotate on an axis. They are not free to do all sorts of things. When you take a large breath, they come up and enlarge the thoracic cavity. As they come up, they rotate outward. They do not rotate outward in a low position. It's very frequently taught that way, but anatomically that is not correct. They must come up to rotate and give you the increased dimension that is necessary for respiration. Here we are. Boy, we've got all sorts of things. You can see again the curve of these ribs downward. Now, in inflation, this curve would have moved up. As it moves up, it would have increased the width on both sides. The same thing here. We have a tremendous enlargement potential. And if you see anybody working for huge lung volumes, you'll see enormous change. Now, I'm not speaking in applied terms for any specific instrument. I'm speaking of taking large breaths to capacity for measurement, not as an application. I'm going to get to that. But we have complications that come into this. You can cool your equipment down now. Follow me with it. I want to indicate another step. If this line were drawn properly, it would be almost straight with a moderate curve. In other words, a healthy young man blowing his breath out as fast as he can will have a maximal speed at the start and a gradual slowing up as he begins to run out of breath, and it can become quite dramatic. And in fact, in this one instance, here's a gentleman in one of the major orchestras. If this is visible there, you can see a line starting here. The chimograph is moving at 480 millimeters a minute. It's specific in its time, but he's blowing as fast as he can, and yet you can see a line curving and curving and curving. This young man is a woodwind player in one of the major symphonies. I won't mention the name, but he has emphysema. Now, a good portion of his breath is still usable, which can keep him in his professional status, but he cannot use the end of his breath. In other words, he has to be able to take a full breath, and from full, he has to go down to half full and rebreathe, or he would be out of his profession because the rest of the air is coming out too slow for use in his profession. Now, this is an abnormal state. It has to do with illness, and we don't have to consider this too much. But I do want to explain certain factors that do occur with all of us. Now, as I said, our respiratory functions are maximal between the ages of 18 and 20. There is a downward deterioration from that time on. It seems strange when you take a man 30 years old and say, well, you're not what you were 10 years ago. But this is true. In respiration, there is this very moderate reduction. Am I closed out already? Or because we've got a long way to go, unless they want us to finish now. But we have what is called a pressure relaxation curve, which I want to explain to you, that ties in and will explain certain problems that occur in playing as we get into it. I'm drawing a curve very similar to an S. Now, if a person has taken in as much air as he can hold, so we have vital capacity, full lungs in this region, and we'll have minimal, or you might say empty lungs as far as you can use it. At about this point, we have the rest position. At night when you're sound asleep, or the way you are right now, all of you could blow out your air. If you suddenly had to cough, you wouldn't have to inhale. You would have enough air that you would be able to cough right now without first inhaling. that would be from this region towards empty. Now, we could call this a plus, we could call this a minus. We have a factor due to the elasticity of lung tissue and muscle fibers, many of the tissues involved in respiration. We have a work potential without muscle contraction. In other words, if you take a deep yawn and sigh, and we use a water manometer or something very sensitive to pick up the movements of air, you will find that the beginning of that sigh with a man with, we'll say, a 5-liter lung capacity, a young man, he will have started that sigh with about a half a pound of expiratory pressure. In some of the bigger ones, it could easily be 3/4 of a pound. This is without ever contracting a blowing muscle, an expiratory muscle, merely by the letting go of what was taken in. Now, it never stays still. There is a constant curve, so that this half a pound, we'll just put that down, a half a pound, it's in a constant varying state until he's down to 0 in this region. Then he has the exact opposite happening. He runs into a negative pressure. In this negative pressure, from the rest position on out, the relaxation of tissue would suck air in, not move air out. Now, in this region, a number of undesirable things happen. It takes much more air pressure to get it out of the lungs. In other words, the intrathoracic pressure within the thoracic cavity has to be vastly increased to try to force air out of the lungs at that time. As you increase the pressure to force it out, you begin to collapse the small tubules in the lungs. You create a condition where it is very hard to take the second breath in. As you're forcing that air out, in any effort, you'll find the capillary beds begin to fill with blood. You have excessive quantities of blood in the tissues at this time. You have overcontraction of the expiratory muscles. You've handicapped the ability to take the second breath. In other words, it becomes very difficult to really undo some of the contraction states necessary to force this air out. Now, as a person gets older, usually, or due to ill health or certain body conditions, this line begins to move up. Instead of down here, it may be up here. We have increasing negative pressure, decreasing positive pressure, which can be used very readily in playing. What we're dealing with here is a biological condition which is not very well known amongst musicians, but it indicates very strongly that you cannot play a high flow rate instrument with shallow breaths. I like to teach always that you play for the end of a phrase, not the beginning. You must be comfortable at the end so you can replace your breath for the next breath, unless you have plenty of time. And in a high flow rate instrument like tuba or trombone, especially bass trombone, where the flow rates can easily be 60, 80 liters per minute and even higher, then it's very important that you have plenty of air in the lungs or you can get it out. Now, I'm going to open this for questions right away. Am I running short of time already? Because this is a lengthy subject. I suppose I should have started it on our first session, but yes, sir.
You were talking about the realization that the muscles of the lung, and then the first session you were talking about warm-up. So shouldn't you also warm up your lungs and do like specific exercises?
It's very wise. That's a good question. You don't warm it up in the sense of increasing the blood supply or anything like that, but you do find, like an arm, full extension by taking several very large inhalations and exhalations. This would be very wise and very good thing to do in a practical sense. If I'm permitted with time, I do want to get to some very practical applications, but I want you to understand there are complications here, and I wanted to get this in, that in the average individual, the young man, we expect 80% of his air to come out in 1 second. Blowing as fast as he can, 80% of his vital capacity should be able to come out, and within 3 seconds, he should be able to take the air in the negative curve out. Now, this varies greatly in individuals, and with disease states and age, that 80% can easily fall to 50%, and instead of 3 seconds, I've had people with abnormal conditions 19 seconds, and they still haven't emptied their lungs. Obviously, that slow air will have pressure, but cannot be used as flow in playing a brass instrument. In other words, if they go by pressure, they think they're still working, but they have no ability to move the air as flow, and as a result, it is not a practical phenomena. They could still play, but they have to get into the air that can be moved out. So I can't spend too much time in this, I can see, because of our schedule, but what I want to get into is certain practical aspects of respiration. In a warning, I would like very much to warn against the tuba player using only diaphragmatic inhalation. That is, it's very good. In other words, diaphragm in health is just great. Diaphragm in function is great, but diaphragm isolated from the rest of your function is a 40 to 50% item. And on the tuba, with our high flow, we cannot get by. In other words, with flow rates of 40, 50, 60, 80, and at times 120 liters per minute, you must always consider the end of the phrase, and we cannot having the person beginning to struggle for quantities, because he's going to have all sorts of problems with his tongue and throat, and then gradually the embouchure, because the air cannot come out fast enough. We have sensors in the lungs that indicate pressure to the brain, and if you have to have pressure of air, but there's no ability to move the air, your throat will close due to the activity of a part of the brain. If your throat doesn't close, the tongue will raise up. But somewhere you take the upper end of a cylinder and choke it off. And it's done instinctively. It is not by consciousness at all. It'll free up when you have the quantities of air that you can use freely in the lungs. So what I'm trying to indicate is I would say tuba, above any instrument at all, the average person never has to worry about over-breathing. In other words, I would say the average tuba player here would have approximately 5 liters lung capacity. I have only slightly in excess of 3 now. When I was a young man, I might have had a little less than 5. But nevertheless, this is not large. We have some with over 7. Now, what this means, of course, is that if you start out with 4 liters, if you have 5, if you start out with a 4.5 liter inhalation and you end with 2, you're still in business. In other words, that next breath will be quite comfortable. You can use your bowl freely. If you start out with 2.5 liters and you're going towards empty, you're entering this region of malfunction at the bottom of the curve. Now, you'll see the player at that time turn red. He'll be distressed. You'll see the veins popping out on his neck. You'll find all sorts of excessive contraction states coming into muscle, but the air is slowing up. This can be tested in a laboratory. This is not guesswork. In other words, this can very definitely be corroborated. But as they enter this negative curve, they do run into problems in the upper end of the cylinder, which we could liken anywhere from the larynx on up. And it'll induce this. Now, what's involved? Taking the breath in. Yes?
Would your advice to such a person be that the tuba is the wrong instrument?
No. It's a matter of finding his true, might say, comfortably large breath, so the synchronization of the entire respiratory system is established in a natural way. In other words, you can take your breath and in a fraction of a second take it all in very easily. And I replaced all of my lung capacity without any problem whatsoever. If you do it by expansion of a specific part, you will then take what that expansion potential calls for. But if you were to segment in any part of you, you'll find you've eliminated other parts of your vital capacity. Now, the key to it is to find the biological key to respiration. And I have to explain this, otherwise I will be missed. Nature has us protected in a way that always some part of us in the respiratory system can take enough air to sustain life, no matter what our posture is or what we're doing. Now, I'm overweight. If I bend over to tie my shoelace and I'm arched forward, the intra-abdominal pressure will increase to such a point that the diaphragmatic descent would be canceled out. In other words, I would no longer have diaphragmatic activity, but I would have upper chest activity, which doesn't take a great volume, but it is there, and all you need is a half a liter to a liter every few seconds to sustain life. So nature has it so that if I'm bending over and all crowded up internally, I can still expand in the upper end. I've had many players come. A horn player was studying with me, whose horn was in the right rib cage. As I analyzed the function, only the left lung was working. Due to the horn in the right rib cage, there was no expansion of the right rib cage. I palpated under the liver. There was no descent of the right lobes of the lung. But the left side was functioning fine. But that's still only a half a breath, no matter how you slice it. Could have been a whole breath by better posture and, you might say, allowing the freedom in the right lung. A very good friend of mine, a trombone player I was working with, I happened to go behind him when he was playing, and after a long concert, his left elbow was digging into the left rib cage, and he's tilted like this. When I'm watching his inhalations, only the right lobes were being filled. The left lobes were inactivated, half breaths. Now, they could have just as easily have been larger breaths if he felt that he needed it, but he would have had posture. Now, we're structured, as I say, so that no matter what bodily position we're in, some part of us can pull air in to sustain life. If I'm doing work around the house and my arms are way back like that, the chest is at right angles to the spine, only the diaphragmatic descent is possible. They're already expanded. There's no place for that to go. So I have diaphragmatic activity, and that's fine to sustain life. Now, what brings them into unit is not the Hatha Yoga system of low breath, followed by mid-range, followed by upper. In other words, the problem with that is that if the diaphragm descends first and creates a rather great enlargement here, you'll have an increase in muscle tonus. All of the muscles of this region are attached up into the rib cage, and they have a combined pull that's downward and inward. That means the upward out movement of the ribs must go under a work load, which normally it shouldn't have. They're already being pulled down and in. For health, it's great, but for the rapid replacement of breath, it's not good. Now, what actually is involved in this is a very simple maneuver. You have to learn to suck. By that, the biological phenomena of suction without friction, you can actually hear that, I'm sure, but now, as soon as you do that, I use sensors at home, I use measuring devices, and you'll see, or if you palpate with the hands, as soon as you pull the air in here, if psychologically you pull air into the mouth, another region of the brain fires up the regions where it must go. If you go by the mechanical principles and try to enlarge them by the thinking part of the brain, you're bypassing the wonderful computer aspects of your brain and getting in your own way. But if you simply suck the air into the mouth, it goes so fast, and in so doing, you'll have found the diaphragmatic descent, the rib cage ascent. It's the simplest thing in the world to do. But, as I say, the key is to work with the air and pull it into the mouth, but avoid the apparatus aspect that pulls it in. We all tend to go to the machine study and bypass the regions of the brain that would be competent to give it to us. In other words, we have to stop controlling the systems by the muscles involved and go instead to the signals in life which control these. If you want to take a huge volume of air into the mouth, you merely draw it into the mouth. It goes somewhere. You'll find that you've had the expansion. All you have to do is suck that air into the mouth. And with soft muscles, it will have enlarged, and you'll have it so easily that with soft muscles, it will have enlarged, and you'll have it so easily that very frequently I'll just put a tube into a student's mouth, and this upsets the old pattern of breathing, the habits, and with the altered stimuli, I ask them to take in a large volume of air through the tube, and they take it in, and they have everything I've asked for without ever knowing what they're doing. I'm always against you knowing what you're doing where it comes to the interior of your body, because there is no way we can know what we're doing. I examine other bodies to find it out, or in dissections you get answers, observation, but you cannot get it through your own sensors. Long after it's right, you'll get some awareness of what's happening based on a generalized concept, but no details. You have no tools for analyzing. What I'm trying to indicate now, very strongly, is the psychology of respiration versus the mechanics of respiration. The mechanics, According to Boyle's law, you would enlarge the various regions. In enlarging, you would have lowered the pressure of the air below atmospheric. The air within the structures would be lower than the outside air, and it would rush in. Now, theoretically, this is great, and if you could do it that way, it would be great. Blowing out, in reduction, you would have the same thing. But I'm not moving any air. In other words, any one of these can be simulated without function. Any one can be simulated without function, with partial function, the substitution of stretch phenomena. The valid signal has to be sought. The valid signal, you go to air, not air apparatus. When you study a cadaver on the table, you put a spirometer on the face, push on the chest and abdomen, air moves out of the lungs if it's fresh. Enlarge them, air will move in. With a live person, you never do that. You always signal the brain what you want. You want to inhale? Take the air in. It's that simple. We have to find the simple answer. And you must permit the enlargement that would come with the extreme. In other words, many students come to me and say, you must never elevate the sternum. They don't use that word. They say, never raise your shoulders. Clavicular breathing would be all wrong. In other words, this is clavicular breathing. This, of course, is a phenomena which it is not for the respiratory activity. However, if you watch a person ill with a respiratory problem, he cannot stay in bed lying flat on his back. He has got to sit up. In severe distress, he will get up and fix his hands on a table or a chair so that the shoulder girdle will be elevated, and the muscles then will be in a higher position, better able to influence the upper lobes. I'm not recommending this for the brass player, you understand, but I am saying that even here there are certain elements that should be taken into consideration. This is not just a ridiculous phenomena, but clavicular breathing in itself is something that we don't concern ourselves with. But in full capacity breathing, there is enlargement of the sternum, there's enlargement upward of the rib cage, lowering of the diaphragm. Now, we know that there's a problem near the end of the breath. Our vocal people have resolved much of this by taking the large volume of air, I would say not so much the large volume as the expanded position of volume, the enlarged chest. Now, if I talk like this, my goodness, I'm going along and just talking with resonance and so forth, the diaphragm is already turned up, lowered, but the chest is still in the enlarged position. I have never entered the negative curve of respiration. In other words, by starting in the simulated full position of air, I am actually using quite a bit of air. There's a considerable amount of air in the lungs, and due to the fact I did not allow this deflation, I have also not entered this negative curve, which would have influenced the larynx in a negative way. This is one of the techniques that many good vocal teachers use. However, that takes certain people. I worked with a young lady, a singer, who had a tiny little 2,800 milliliter vital capacity and was being taught singing by a large male, and she couldn't complete her phrases. This man had probably in excess of 6-liter lung capacity, and this little girl with only 2,800 milliliters, her fraction of air that she could use would be less than half. Well, less than half, even if she had taken in a maximal breath, would still not be much fuel. Now, if I just talk and I allow my diaphragm to raise up, in other words, I'm withdrawing the abdominal wall, I would be out now, but I could still keep on as long as I lower the chest, and gradually I hit this curve where I'm in trouble now. But I could have gained another second or two, depending on how fast I was using it, by permitting deflation, so that all parts of you that expand in inhalation deflate, they reduce in exhalation. The muscle activity is different, but what you see in enlargement actually is a return back due to other muscles, but they definitely return back to their reduced state. Now, any point that has enlarged should be considered potentially a region that can reduce in exhalation. I don't favor this type of teaching. I'm discussing this because of a need for understanding. I like to teach always the art form of music, and when you need air, take it in good taste. Become alerted to air as a phenomena of motion, not body. But to understand why you must do it that way, you have to realize there are complications in the bodily activity, and the ability of the body to lie is simply enormous. I can take in a huge breath. For me, that's huge. Or I can simulate. And you would probably not know the difference unless I made that sound. I could create the expansion. He's in again. Harvey, did I run out?
I hate to do this, but we have a schedule we have to stick to.
Right.
We have building personnel to deal with, and I'm going to ask Jake to, if he would, to wind up in about 5 minutes, and we're going to start our concert at 8:15. So that'll give us a little more time.
Well, I would like then
We
just
have
to
a
ask
setup
questions,
to
you know, if anybody has any specific question that I can
Here's the young
respond
man way
to.
back there.
Right.
What I would like to know then is what would the conscious process be of taking a breath in?
Well, as I say, it's a matter of suction. I have the equipment, but I don't have the time to demonstrate it here. But if you use sensitive devices near the mouth, you can actually see the air going in as you inhale, so that you work for the air as you experience it external to the body, moving inward. So, as I say, suction without friction, so that we don't have the sound of a fricative, but the sound of wind. If you blow out and you create a certain sound, that was too much, but the sound in reverse would be very, very similar. So it's a wind sound. When you become engrossed in the sound of the breath, you'll soon find you also have the breath. Yes?
What about circular breathing?
Circular breathing requires a big mouth. I'm not saying this in a facetious way exactly, but what is involved is putting enough air in the mouth to where, through the palate activity, you can close off the pharynx. In other words, breathe through the nose for an instant while you're compressing the cheeks and elevating the tongue to continue the movement of air, which would be momentary, while you inhale through the nose and replace. It can be done in pianissimo. I think Chester Schmitz does it quite a bit in Boston. I fooled around with it, but I have a lot of friction in the nose. I'm always having problems, and I can't get much air through it, so I never bothered with it, and I'm not particularly enamored with it either. Yes, sir?
Don't you say you also do not go quite up to full capacity when you're taking a normal breath?
For playing, you rarely would go to 100%, but 85%, 90% of filling should be quite comfortable, and you should rarely get down to within 20% of your minimum of air. In other words, you stop while you still have enough to be somewhat functional, so you don't confuse air pressure with airflow. There has to be a freedom of movement in the air. Otherwise, the wheezing phenomena comes in. And hi, how are you? Just saw an old friend. Yes, sir?
Will you discuss the relationship of pitch to pressure and how the pressure...
Pitch and pressure are really not related to each other the way people tend to think. In other words, if there's insufficient pressure, you will have pitch that's much softer. But you can conceive that to go to a high note will require more air pressure than a lower note. If you don't have the pressure, you will play a high note softer. Pitch is primarily a phenomena of embouchure and little shaping musculatures, but there are requirements that are... In other words, you could apply all sorts of pressure and never change pitch. It's not an end product. It's part of an overall system. And as a result, I don't quite approve of changing pitch by pressure. I like to change pitch by changing pitch, just like a song. And if it involves something else, fine and dandy. We don't fix on it, But if you find that you can do, you might say, apply pressure and not change pitch, then it's really not a valid immediate component to it. It's part of a system in the sense that to retain a given volume between a low C and a C 2 octaves above, you're going to find increased air pressure and decreased flow. But you see, you could actually have the same pressure and you would find that you're merely playing much softer up there. But pitch is an embouchure function.
We have time for one more question.
Is the raising of your shoulders, that due just to the
Would you repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
The shoulders, when your shoulders raise, does that do the pressure in the lungs? Or is that a pulling?
It has to do with the accessory groups of muscles that have to do with filling the lungs for your vital capacity. Now, we have the ability to raise the shoulders without respiration. Every one of the respiratory muscles in life has other things to do than just respiration. There are other functions, and the shoulder girdle is free to raise or lower, and it's really not necessary in any normal breathing patterns. In maximal inhalation, there is a very moderate use which should be minimized in the shoulder girdle. In other words, elevation of the sternum doesn't require the shoulder girdle. In maximal things, in terms of disease states and so forth, air hunger, there can be a certain amount of this brought in. We don't recommend it for musical purposes at all. I think I have to stop now, or Mr. Phillips will run me off the stage.
I'd like to have you go till midnight, Jake, but we've got a very nice tuba ensemble we've got to hear.
Right. Well, I thank you very much. I wished I could have proceeded further. Sorry I upset your schedules like that. Your old friend over there, my goodness.
I'd like to remind you again that Mr. Jacobs performed last evening and drove down here today for this session. He's leaving very early tomorrow morning to resume his very vital role in the Chicago Symphony brass section. And I think we owe him a very special thanks for having crowded his career, his schedule, and his career for that matter, to be with us here today.
It's such an extensive subject, you could go on for half a day.
One more second. I think that says it all right there.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure at some future time we'll get together. I brought all sorts of little gadgets, but I just can't even explain them to you today. But a bunch of my students are in the audience. They'll tell you.
Let me also take this opportunity. I'm sorry I don't have the materials here. All other people can't keep their schedules either. But I want you to know, and I want Mr. Jacobs to know, that he is the one individual who is being honored at this first International Tuba Symposium Workshop, and you will see evidence of this through the week. I might as well tell Mr. Jacobs what we're going to present him, although I can't give it to him now. But he will receive a plaque which will tell him how his colleagues feel about his contributions to the art of tuba playing. He will also receive a scroll which each of you will sign and have an opportunity to express yourself personally as to how you feel about what he has contributed. And we have plenty of footage for you to take advantage of this opportunity. And this scroll will then be sent to other important musicians throughout the world who could not be with us, so that they can add their tributes, and it will be presented to him in a brass cylinder, which he can then extend and hang on his wall at home.
Thank you so much, Bobby. We're tail gunners. We're not used to this sort of thing.
There you have it. there is no greater tribute that any man can receive than the adulation and honor of his peers. And that Mr. Jacobs has earned many times over. 8:15, we start the ensemble portion of our concert. Thank you very much.